Hello, today I'm going to talk about chapter 2. And chapter 2 is talking primarily about uh, crime data and such, which I need to get back here because I need to share my screen. I forgot to do that. All right. So crime data is obviously a collection of statistics that is taken from law enforcement agencies and um, used to try to see the extent, the nature of crime, and then also it can also be used to study whether or not different approaches to criminal justice have any effect on those things. And so we uh, we want to try to have as good of an understanding as we can about what's happening so that we can make informed decisions about what to do about it. We also um, need to recognize the limitations of some of this data. So, like if we're talking about crimes reported to the police, that's not necessarily going to include all the crime that's occurring, you know, and also, there's a kind of well-known kind of saying that, well, you can manipulate statistics to say what you want them to say. And in some cases that is true. You know, it depends on what data you're looking at, so um it doesn't always it isn't always the best thing. But up until about 100 years ago, we didn't really have, in order for you to get crime statistics, you had to go and do a whole lot of labor intensive work because there was nobody that was collecting and actually cataloging this stuff. And so it was kind of painstaking going through records and things like that to try to um, figure out the extent of crimes and what was happening. The FBI, thereabouts 1930, started to this thing called the Uniform Crime Report. It's always been voluntary thing that uh, law enforcement agencies voluntarily submit their data to the FBI for this report. But we had very good compliance with it because over the years they have made it conditional to get federal grants. In order to get federal grants, you have to agree to send UCR data to the FBI. So, and just about every agency somewhere down the line has gotten federal money, so therefore they do it. So when we're talking about crime statistics, we talk about crimes reported to the police, that'd be like the UCR data, but we also have a national crime victimization survey, which is basically they send out a survey to a sample of Americans, and they self-report whether they've been victims of crime and answer various questions. And that's intended to kind of get at what's called the dark figure of crime, which is the crimes that aren't reported to the police. This little diagram is really trying to visualize that we have a whole lot of crimes that probably occur. And then of those crimes that occur, how many are reported to the police? So that's a lesser number that are reported to the police. And of those crimes that are that happen and then are reported to the police, then how many times do we actually get far enough along that we make arrests, right? And then that's even fewer cases. And then of those cases where we have enough and we make arrests, how many actually go and get charged, where they're actually going to get put on trial and stuff. And then, from there, you know, it just, there's a lot fewer cases that proceed all the way through all of the steps. So we talked about all of those steps, right? Because in order to get to a conviction, we have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. That is a very high bar. To arrest somebody, we need probable cause. That's a lower bar. So there's a lot of times that we get to probable cause, we make the arrest, we send it to trial, but then we never get enough evidence to really get it over the hump for trial. So it either ends up being plea bargained to a lesser crime or gets outright dismissed by the court, or some of those cases we are able to get them to either plead, or we get additional evidence that puts us up to beyond a reasonable doubt. So 1927, I said 1930. Oh, 1930 is when the FBI got it. Okay. So there's part one and part two offenses. I'm not going to bore you with that or expect you to know the difference, but primarily, the index crimes are really what we have the most, what's the word? The most full data about. Um, they have since rebranded the UCR as NIBRS, which stands for National Incident Based Reporting System. But I think generally people are still calling it UCR. So since since 1930, when they began collecting this data, they publish a report every year, and we're been able to track particular types of crime nationally, whether they're increasing, decreasing, and trends like that. And it's been used for lots of different things. It's been used by individual police departments to try to discuss policy changes or shifts or anything like that. And then it's also been used, in politics, for politicians trying to suggest what should be done legislation wise that might have an impact on the crime rates and stuff like that. So after the war, crime trended down. 1960s, crime trended up, continued through the 1990s. From the 1990s until today, it trended down, or till 2013, it has trended down, and currently we are seeing an uptick again. That being said, this is talking about national trends. It's a lot is unique to individual areas. So crime could be trending up nationally and be down locally. But it is good to have objective data, right? So that we're not just going on wild speculation or basing it on perception, like from like media coverage and things like that, that we can actually get real data. Murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, would be the violent crimes, crimes against persons. The property crimes include motor vehicle theft, larceny, which is regular theft, and burglary. And the reason that we separated motor vehicle theft out is because we want to be able to track that separately. We want to know the clearance rate for various crimes. In other words, how often do we get to a point where we make an arrest? You know, it'd be nice if we could track, the entire court process, but unfortunately, that is um, difficult, because law enforcement agencies aren't going to be the ones to get the data from there, right? We would have to involve the court systems in order to know where it goes from there. So we talk about the clearance rate as far as from a law enforcement standpoint. How often do we, when we get certain types of crimes reported to us, how often are we able to make an arrest, right? And so cleared by arrest. And then when it talks about exceptional means, we're talking about like something like the person died or the victim changed their mind and decided they didn't want to proceed or they didn't want to cooperate with prosecution, that kind of stuff. That's what they mean by exceptional means. It means we still think this person did it, but we weren't able to arrest them because either they died or we don't have a case. Murder is obviously the most serious crime that one human being can commit against another. First degree murder, we're talking about pre-planning, and that's really the essential element of it, is that you plan this to some degree. Now, how long does it take to make a plan? But the idea is first degree murder is not spontaneous. It's something you thought about. It's something you planned for. It's something, and that makes it worse somehow. And so that's first degree murder is the only crime that can get the death penalty now. And so it is kind of in a category by itself. Murder, not only does it have the highest rate of reporting amongst all of them, but it also has it tends to have the highest clearance rate in a lot of ways because of the fact that it is such a visceral crime, that is kind of universally acknowledged as being wrong. And so we tend to have the best chance of having cooperation from all parties involved, aside from the suspect, obviously. And then we also tend to spare no expense, as far as our approach to investigating these crimes. So, it takes a lot of painstaking work sometimes to put together a complicated case, right? And there's nothing more complicated than a murder trial, right? And so it's going to require a whole lot of effort and energy, to put into it. And so, but even departments with limited budgets are going to be more willing to expend those resources in pursuit of a murder trial than they are, in some petty misdemeanor or something like that. So that being said, we tend to do all right with murder. Aggravated assault is, where somebody's seriously injured, they just don't die. That tends to get the same kind of uh, full court press type of an investigation. burglary is difficult because it it frequently happens in unoccupied homes, and um, there's not a lot to go on, unless you have a situation where it's a person that's known to them or something like that. And even now with the proliferation of cameras, I might have a camera, image showing an individual in the place, but if that person isn't recognizable to me, or if they're wearing, coverings on their face or whatever, all I can tell generally is, you know, maybe build and general description. So that being said, um, it's it's difficult. Other kinds of theft, it's also, kind of difficult for the same reasons, really. Um, but it also sometimes tends to go under unreported. And that's the benefit of having the victimization survey data, because it's going to show a much higher instance of certain crimes. So you can kind of see, or have some picture into how much crime really is going unreported. Identity theft is definitely a modern crime that is difficult. Not only do we have the difficulties in investigating it, but then we also have the fact that it can be at this point international, where you know your identity is being used by somebody overseas, and our ability to go and actually bring them to justice and hold them accountable is hobbled by the bureaucratic red tape of trying to you know deal with international bureaucracy. So motor vehicle theft, you would think in the modern age, with all the fancy features we have on the car, anti-theft features that we have on the cars, you would think that motor vehicle theft would just be, at this point, just limited to classic cars or whatever, but nope. They find a way. And you know arson is also difficult, because it tends to be done you know in secret. So unless you have, you know some reason to, have an actual suspect, it's difficult. They do collect information on other crimes, lesser crimes, but it's generally just talking about how many arrests are made, and it's not really as much information at all. That crime victimization survey started in the 70s, and it's based on self-reporting. And so the real benefit here, um, I mean, the difficulty with it, or the limitation to it, is of course it's self-reported. So do they really, are they telling the truth or not? But that being said, um, the real benefit comes here, is based upon the victimization survey data. These are the reported numbers here on the right of various types of crime. Now, obviously, nobody's going to self-report that they were killed because they'd be dead. They can't do that. So we don't have that data on homicide, but we do know that, you know, there is an unreported figure there, because you have people that are kind of on the fringes of life that get killed and nobody reports it because they don't have anybody that cares enough about them to report or notice that they're gone. So, I mean, there are going to be certain number of people that get killed and nobody knows, but that number is pretty low. Rape, you look at the rape, we're talking about 30%. Robbery, we're talking about little more than half. Um, Aggravated assault is pretty close. Burglary, we're talking double, or half that are reported. Larcenies, more than double. So you see what I'm saying? Like, there's a lot more rapes that happen than are what reported. And so, now that we have some reason to suspect that's the case, I think it's important to talk about why that might be. Why is it that people aren't reporting crimes that are occurring, that they're victims of? And there's several reasons. In particular, if you're talking about rape, and other sex offenses and stuff, I mean, that is about the most personal crime that there is, right? And it is an uphill battle to prosecute those cases because, generally speaking, you basically have two parties involved almost, and almost always there's no witnesses, there's no, you know and sometimes there's other evidence, like forensic evidence and stuff like that, but sometimes there's not. And so, it's quite an ordeal to put oneself through, you know and an uphill battle all the way. And so, in cases where the victim feels partially responsible, or the victim feels like they're not going to get support, or the victim feels like there's not enough evidence to prove it, sometimes they're not going to report it at all, because they don't want to put themselves through that. They don't want other people to know. They don't want. Trial is a very public proceeding. You know, when people get arrested and stuff like that, a lot of times it ends up getting media attention and stuff like that. And so, um, depending on what it is. And so there's a pretty good reason why rape would probably be about the most underreported crime. Other things, though, might come from that. If, for example, if somebody robbed somebody of something that they weren't legally allowed to possess. So if you're 18 years old and somebody steals your beer, you know, are you going to report that to the cops? Like, well, no, because then you'd have to explain why you had beer underage. So, you know, sometimes people don't report crimes because they also are guilty of other crimes, or they might have warrants, and they got beat up, but they don't want to report it to the cops because the cops will arrest them on their outstanding warrants. So they don't want to involve the cops. It may have nothing to do with the particular crime being solvable or not. Um, sometimes on the larceny side of things, they just might recognize that there's just not a case. And so it could be that, um, they're gonna just not report it. Here's another interesting little thing I've noticed on this chart anyway, is fewer people report that they've had their car stolen than the actual reports would say. So there could be a margin of error here, you know, but I think generally for what we generally use it for discussion wise, it fits. Like there is what they call a dark figure of crime. There is certain crimes in particular that are not reported to the police as frequently as they occur. And it's important to be mindful of that because when statistics trend up and trend down or whatever, you may not have a full picture of it. You may see a decline. For example, you may see a decline in the reporting of certain crimes. Likewise, you may see a decline because there's fewer police officers in a location or whatever to take these reports and stuff. So, you know, just because the reported to police crime statistics go down doesn't mean you should just automatically assume that it's valid. Um, that being said, um, there are specific categories of crime that have their own unique challenges to investigate, right? So trying to investigate like people trying to defraud elderly people, um, the kind of corporate type white collar crime, um, trying to build cases against organized crime and gang groups and stuff, um, cybercrime, terrorism, drug networks and things like that. Like they become their own categories of uh, law enforcement. Sometimes we have drug task force, we have cyber crimes task force, we have uh, sex crime, uh, special victims type prosecutors and stuff. It's um, some of these categories are specialties in and of themselves. Computer crime, you know, um, we're just now at the sheriff's office that I'm working at for the first time. We're actually gonna um, get the Celebrite. It's a software that you're able to download and you know like digital evidence from phones and computers and such. So you know because up till now, whenever we had cases where that was necessary, we would have to send it off to Kansas City and wait weeks. And, it's kind of hamstrung us on several investigations where, yeah, when you're talking about a suspect phone or whatever, that's fine. But, sometimes you need that data pretty quick. And also it helps like when we're talking about like victims and witnesses and stuff like that to be able to just say, hey, let me borrow your phone for an hour and I'll have it right back to you versus it's going to take weeks. So that being said, there's lots of caveats there, but um, basically the whole point of the chapter really is that crime statistics can be a powerful tool, but we also have to understand where they come from and what they represent. Because again, it's just because the UCR says, this is trending down, that doesn't mean that it's occurring less frequently necessarily. It just means that they have fewer reports of it and or they have a lower clearance of it. So that being said, uh, that's all I have for this week. So let me done. Have a good weekend.